Present afternoon, ma'am. Can we start?
Yeah, how many have logged in, Ravi?
Around 20.
Good afternoon, everyone. So continuing the training programs for research through the Ramaya Medical College Division of Research and Patents, today we have a very important topic, ethics in research, ethics for research. And it's an integral component whenever any researcher is undertaking any research activity. The first and foremost component is that of ethics. So in the medicine, we would have been taught about primum non nocere, where doing good, but most important is not to do harm to the individuals participating in the research. And there has been a sea of change in the guidelines, rules, and what needs to be done for research in medical sciences. So today's training program is going to focus on some of the practical applications, the revised guidelines by ICMR, and we'll be having a Q&A session where some of the doubts which would be raised by the participants will be addressed. So I welcome the participants as well as we have our Dean, Dr. Mehra Rao. Ma'am, welcome to this event. And we have Vice Dean, Dr. Vice Principal Shalini Nui, ma'am. And the participants from different departments are logging in. So we'll start the program without much ado. Ma'am, your opening remarks. Mehra, ma'am.
A very good afternoon to everyone, and namaste to Dr. Roli Mathur. At the outset, we are so happy to see you, and thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. We considered this as our honor that you accepted the invitation to be with us today. Needless to say how critical the topic is. And further, without any exaggeration, let me say that, in my opinion, I don't think there could have been anybody better than you for this topic. And to the participants, let me share my personal experience listening to Dr. Roli Mathur on more than one occasion. And I can assure you that her talk is, point number one, it is information packed. It is styled in a very nice way where it's very easy to comprehend. The flow is optimum and the pace is exactly what is beneficial for the participants. So all the delegates can definitely look forward to some kind of handsome takeaways at the end of this session. And trust me, this is neither exaggeration nor flattery. I meant everything, every single word, what I said about what you can look forward to. I really don't have to stress the importance of this topic. Today, training of ethics in different ways, whether it is ethical outlook, practice of ethics, awareness of the dilemmas, inculcating the capability of handling the ethical dilemmas, is done in every profession and it's required in every walk of life. And research, on the other hand, is increasingly gaining so much importance worldwide. So it's really, really appropriate to be completely not aware, but understand in depth about ethics in research. And that way, I must congratulate Dr. Nanda, Dr. Shalini, and the team of the DRP division of Ramaya Medical College for choosing this topic and the best choice of the speaker as well. And that said, let me wind up wishing good luck to everyone. And once again, on behalf of the management and all of us, a very big thank you to Dr. Roli Mathur.
Can I request Dr. Shalini Nui ma'am to introduce the speaker, please?
Thank you, Dr. Nandakumar. I'm really delighted to introduce Dr. Roli Mathur. She heads the ICMR Bioethics Unit at NCDIR, Bangalore, and is the nodal officer for the Department of Health Research National Ethics Committee Registry. She is member secretary of the ICMR Central Ethics Committee on Human Research, which serves as the National Ethics Committee. Her department is recognized as a WHO collaborating center for strengthening ethics, and this is the first one in the WHO Southeast Asia region. She is also a university topper and gold medalist during graduation and post-graduation. Further, she received the Young Scientist Award for her doctoral research in molecular genetics at AIIMS, New Delhi, followed by postdoc training at National University of Singapore. She received the WHO Fellowship in Bioethics and Ethics Committee Administration in the United States, followed by training to be an international surveyor of ethics committees. She is a member of several WHO expert groups, namely Ethics and COVID, Ethics and Governance of Artificial Intelligence in Health, benchmarking indicators for ethics committees, and also executive committee member of Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, which has recently released ethics guidelines for research in low resource settings. At ICMR, Dr. Roli Mathur had earlier steered the ICMR National Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research on Human Participants in 2017, Definitions Pertaining to End-of-Life Care 2018, Handbook on Ethical Guidelines 2019, and the ICMR Policy on Research Integrity and Publication Ethics. Common Forms for Ethics Committees 2019, and the ICMR Consensus Guidance on Do Not Attempt Resuscitation, DNAR 2020. National Guidelines for Ethics Committees Reviewing Research During COVID-19 in 2020. She was acknowledged to be among the top women scientists at ICMR on International Women's Day. After such a stellar curriculum vitae, Dr. Roli Mathur, I'm really delighted to welcome you to talk to us today.
Thank you very much for the very kind invitation. I have to thank Dr. Medha Rao, Dr. Shalini, Dr. Nandakumar for giving me this opportunity to speak on a topic which is really my favorite topic, and I love talking about it all the time. But I think, Dr. Rao, you've set up really high standards for me, so I have to really match up with your, I hope that I'll be able to speak to you all and, impart this information in an easy manner, and feel free to ask as many questions, and also, you can write to us also if you need more information. So I think I'm deeply honored and nervous now that with this big introduction that I don't want to disappoint anyone. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. I'll begin my presentation. And I'll mainly be talking about the two guidelines of ICMR, the National Guidelines 2017, the purple book that you see on your left-hand side, and the recent guidelines on COVID, during COVID-19 for ethics committees, because these are the main documents that are relevant to us today. Of course, there are other documents which ICMR has prepared. And so this is my first slide shows you the glimpse of some of the other documents that are also available on the website. You can just Google in ICMR Bioethics Unit to get a link to our publications. which can all be downloaded at no cost. And feel free to write to us for hard copies if you would like, and we can share hard copies as well with you all. So during COVID-19, I mean, because it just landed on us, and researchers and ethics committees found it very difficult to conduct research. So our DGICM, of course, the 2017 guidelines had a special section on humanitarian emergencies and disaster, but still when the actual pandemic struck us, the researchers were really caught and they did not know how to go about it, and ethics committee didn't know how to meet. So some of the new added challenges were tackled in the new guidelines, which have understood and tried to tackle the increased vulnerabilities and the altered governance framework, in view of the social distancing norms and other limitations that, due to the lockdown, there were new challenges. So finding out novel methodologies to adopt this to this changed environment, adopting new digital tools. So we have all become such experts in online meeting that we don't feel the need of meeting physically now. So, but then at that time, when we brought out this guideline in April last year, it was really something new. And I'm also happy to share with you that India was amongst the first country in the world to bring out a guideline that fast, because this was a guideline for ethics committee that was prepared at that time, and it tackled about it, discussed how to review COVID related research or non-COVID related research also, because that should not stop at all. And also how to handle the ongoing research projects, because you may be already having some other research studies. So how do you, make sure that they are implemented in an ethical manner? So these were the things that were tackled. Principles of ethics, we are all aware, and I am not going into it, but we do understand that respect for people, to do good and to do no harm, like Dr. Nand Kumar just introduced us to these principles, and the principle of justice, where we want to make sure that no particular individual or group of people are discriminated or stigmatized or targeted upon for benefits of others. So we must ensure that there is justice. The people who participate in research are also the ones who benefit out of research. Also, I wanted to point out the fact that the scope of the guidelines is not only biomedical research. Often at times we do a lot of socio-behavioral research as well related to health. So even that is covered in the guidelines, because number of times even at ICIMA we have seen people apply for socio-behavioral studies and they say this is not under any guideline, this is socio-behavioral research. But it is also covered in the ICMR guidelines. And also when we are doing research, not only on individuals and people, but also if we are doing research on their data, clinical information, or their samples which are stored in our laboratories. So even those materials, if you are using them, the guidelines need to be followed. On your left, you see the 12 sections of the main 2017 document. And on your right, you see the 5 sections that are there in the brief new guidelines related to COVID. So I'll briefly address all of these in my forthcoming slides. So an important section in the main guideline is about general ethical issues. These are a variety of issues that we face in our conduct of research as well as review of research. Often we find it more theoretical. We always say that the benefit risk assessment has to be done and benefit risk ratio should be favorable. So how do we do it, and who does it, and how does it done? So it is not a quantitative methodology that we have proposed that, you use this formula to know this is the benefit and risk. Unfortunately, we do not have a simple formula to that, but it is not only the ethics committee that has to decide about it, but it is right at the level of the researcher that when they are planning research, they must think about what are the kind of benefits that would come out of the study. And the benefits could be directly, in favor of the patient, or they may not be direct benefits. They may be indirect benefits in terms of health benefits, or they could be even no benefit at all to the participant, but it could be for improvement of a methodology, development of new scientific tools, or for future science. Whatever it is, we must write it down. We must know clearly that what are the kind of benefits that are expected. And on the other hand, try to list out the risks that are involved. Is the risk also direct to an individual, or is the risk indirect, or is the risk actually a harm or a discomfort? Even harms and discomforts which are not directly related to intervention. For example, somebody says that this is not a clinical trial, I'm only collecting some measurements, or I'm collecting some information, so there is no risk. So even collection of information may carry some kind of risk of harm. Or sometimes there are 5 extra visits that a person has to make to your site. So even that is a discomfort, because a person will have to lose wages, or they have to spend money on transportation. So we have to think of what kind of risk, whether these are physical risk or psychological, social, legal, or material risk. So in those terms, and then try to make an assessment. And that is exactly what the ethics committee also needs to do later as an independent body. And another important point here is that based on the risk benefit assessment, an ethics committee can decide whether your project will fit into exemption from review or expedited for review, or will it go to the full committee for review. So if a research is of a nature where there is no risk at all, it's really less than minimal, very, very low, or no risk at all, some data is already collected, like you mentioned in the beginning introduction also, that some samples are already there. And so, such research may actually fall under exemption category if it is anonymized, because if you do not know, or you have samples left over and you do not know to whom they belong to, for example. So that type of research can even be exempted from review. However, as per the guidelines, the exemption is decided by the ethics committee and not by the researcher. The researcher can understand that whether the research fits into those categories and request the ethics committee to give an exemption, or to do an expedited review, or to go through full review. And I'll come to the forms later, but the forms that we have designed help in that process, help the researcher to know for himself whether which category my research is fitting into. So that is about the benefit risk. And then coming to privacy confidentiality, we all understand that the information about a person that we collect as a part of research has to be protected. So there is a different standard here. So we are collecting a lot of information from patients who come for their checkup or for their treatments. So as a physician, you're wearing a different hat. But as a researcher, you're wearing a different hat, and all that information that you collect as a researcher has to be safeguarded. It will not be in the same file where all the other hospital records are. Research records have to be kept confidentially. Then the issue about distributive justice. It is that individuals who are selected to participate are in a manner that there is no discrimination, because let's say, for example, that a particular socioeconomically group, it's very easy to recruit these people because they don't understand, or they're not well educated. So one should not target a particular group, and if you have targeted, it has to be as per their health needs. And if it is as per their health needs, the results or outcomes have to translate back, go back to that individual. Usually for researchers, the study ends with a publication. So you write up a project, you apply to a funding agency, it gets funded, you undertake the study, you publish, and that is it. However, these results do not go back to the people from whom the data has been collected. So that's also an important ethical responsibility of benefit sharing and keeping them involved in the way we do research. It's not like a one-time contact where we only obtain information, their samples, but don't go back to them with the findings. So it's important to communicate back the results of the study. Now, payments for compensation, often these are involved. So one ethics committee would like to see that, whether the patients are being made to pay something extra for research, and that should not happen. So if it is a research, it should be funded through other means, and patients should not bear the cost of research. In case there has been an injury that has been due to the participation directly, due to the drug or due to the intervention, then a provision has to be there for compensation. So what the guidelines have suggested is that every institution that is engaged in biomedical research or clinical trials should try to develop a corpus funding. So within the institution, for example, when let's say Ramaya or any other institution that applies to ICMR for funding, and you get funding in for equipment, staff, contingencies, a small amount of money can also be asked for payment of compensation. Or under the overhead charges, some grant is received which could be used for payment of compensation if it is so required. It's actually a major mind block that compensation will be really huge, but generally for every project, if you start collecting that amount, and it can be built into a corpus funding. So that is one way. The other suggestion is that institutes could think of taking insurance policies for their research studies. And so these three suggestions are there. One is to build the corpus funding. The second is to seek grants from funding agency, whether it is national or international. So whatever projects are written, one should ask for some budget for payment of compensation in case of any injury, and it could depend on the kind of research. Some research are higher risk, some are less risk. So accordingly, the budgets can be asked for. Then conflict of interest issues are really difficult issues to handle, because these conflicts exist at every level, whether it is the researchers, because all of us have certain secondary interests. One is our primary interest, which is to do the research. But then we also have a secondary interest of, getting a promotion, getting an award, or publishing a paper, getting a grant. So when these secondary interests become more important than the primary interest, which is about the research and safeguarding the patient or the participant, then there is a problem. Therefore, there has to be an independent mechanism to monitor that whether there is a conflict of interest. An ethics committee will do that job. They will ask the researchers, they would like to know what are the ties, what are the things. Is there any, for example, in some clinical trials, there is per patient recruitment fees, especially oncology studies and some particular subjects, there are per patient fees. So ethics committee would like to know all about it. Sometimes these conflicts are at the level of ethics committee, because it's a project of your colleague, you want to approve it, or you don't want to approve it, you don't like your colleague, or it is your student's project. So there are various such social issues, or, in the West, they are more financial. Here, they may be social issues. And thirdly, at the level of institution as well. So even sometimes the institutions, because they want a grant, they may put pressure on the ethics committee to approve or disapprove a study. So that is why we say the ethics committee has to work independently on these pressures, or away from all these pressures. And it's also said in the guideline that the decision-making authorities of institutions should not be part of the ethics committee, so that they don't influence the members of the committee for a particular type of decision-making. And the members are more free to discuss, the ethics part, and freely they can discuss in the absence of the senior authorities in the committee. Then community engagement. Now, this is another term which is easier to say, but to do it is not so easy. Because every research actually requires a meaningful engagement before, during, after, with the communities with whom we are working on. And we must see what are the culturally sensitive areas which we need to build rapport on, to build the public trust. Often we see that, what is happening today is that the public doesn't trust doctors. Public is losing the trust for research, and we see ICMR is also getting beaten up all the time continuously. Where are we going wrong? What is going wrong? The thing is, we are not able to communicate effectively. We are not able to tell our part properly in a manner that they would understand. We don't have time to do that. We just do our work and publish, but we don't really do advocacy enough, which is important to build that rapport with the community. So there is enough information should go out, and prevent infodemic, because we see that WhatsApp University is churning out new stories every day, scaring people and all that. And see how we can involve community into our work. Is there a way to have them as part of the study team? Is there a way to invite them in as a member, as an invitee during the ethics committee meeting to understand their concerns? So those are some of the things we can see. So post-research access and benefit sharing, I just mentioned that we need to go back and deliver back the findings. Storage of biological material data sets is another area. We must plan it right away. When we are planning the study, the researchers must think now, would I like to store these samples? Will they have any value? So on one hand, we understand this is really rich, important biological material. Should it go down the bin or should it be stored for long-term use? What kind of uses do we foresee? If we see any future use of those samples, because they may be rare samples, they may be really important, it may be impossible to get back those samples. So in that case, at the time when the research is being planned, a proper informed consent should be taken from the participants so that these can be used for future. Otherwise, these samples become, you cannot use them because you don't have informed consent from people and it may be impossible to go back to them for seeking their consent. So it's very important. And it is not only biological material, but also their data. You're collecting a lot of clinical information, whether you're going to analyze this information. If you're going to plan to analyze that information, and if it is non-anonymized information, identified information, you will need consent again. So it's important to think about this right now rather than thinking about it later. Collaboration is very important. We should encourage collaboration, but when we plan collaboration, there should be partnership. We must have clear-cut rules and regulations. Who is responsible for what? How the data sharing will happen, who will do analysis, how the patents will be there. And if it is an international collaboration, then how the rights of our country are protected. Are we only providers of biological material? As I see in the area of genetics, it happens all the time. We are only providers of genetic samples, and the work is being done in the Western laboratories and the publications are coming out. And the Indian author will have some 20th or 25th name in the huge list of authors which are there, and they are still happy that, I got a publication. So is this the right thing to do? Is it a way that we must build capacity in our own country to try to do it, partner, but try to build our own capacity? Public health and socio-behavioral research is another important area. We have a whole chapter, 2 chapters actually on this area. And roles of agencies, sponsors, governance has also been highlighted, where all the agencies have an important role to support research, and this has been discussed, as well as biosafety in labs and hospitals. Then I think I discussed all of this, collaboration, everything. Yeah, I discussed this. Okay. So the responsible conduct of research is the section 3 in the main guideline, and it is an important section for all researchers. Actually, everybody who's involved in research in any manner to read about it, because it tells us that as a scientist, as a responsible member of society, what are the responsibilities, how we should do mentoring, what should be the institutional policies, how standard operating procedures to be followed, conflicts of interest to be managed, in the acquiring the data, managing them, compiling, analyzing, sharing, ownership of materials. And then it has also discussed the authorship issues, peer review process. If there is scientific misconduct, how does an institution handle the same? And collaborative research through good memorandum of understandings and material transfer agreements between the bodies have to be there in place, so that there is transparency, we are aware of our rights, and there is accuracy and honesty in the way these are reported. Now, all this responsibility comes on poor ethics committee, which is often, people are doing it just as an honorary work, and they don't get paid and they don't have time, it's just an added extra work for them. But it's important the ethics committee works independently. Independent doesn't mean a private ethics committee here. It means that it works independently. It is a competent committee which understands all the rules, regulations. It does robust decision-making in a time-bound manner to safeguard the participants. It is responsible for doing the scientific as well as ethics review. So it must make sure that there is good science as well as good ethics. They are responsible for doing an initial review as well as continuing review of research, and the decision making regarding ongoing. One second, there is some noise in my background. Close the windows. Yeah, sorry. And an important thing is that the ethics committee needs to be facilitatory and friendly. So often researchers don't like ethics committees because ethics committee raises questions. How can the ethics committee do this in a manner that the researchers feel more confident? They don't want to avoid ethics review, but they want the ethics committee to help them, support them. Because basically the researchers and ethics committees as well as sponsors, everybody is on the same, same side, because we all want good research, good outcomes. So in what way can ethics committee guide researchers better rather than being critical? This cannot be done, this should not be done. They should give constructive suggestions so that the research should be done. That should be the objective. And ethics committee need to be abreast with the latest and be registered now with the CDSCO, which is a Central Drug Standards and Control Organization, if they are reviewing clinical trials, and also with Department of Health Research if they are reviewing biomedical health research. So there are 2 registrations that are needed now. And all types of research has to be reviewed before it is initiated. And also on the right, I have just put out some of the points for ethics committee. So ethics committee, we all understand, has to be multidisciplinary with the age, gender balance, 7 to 15 members, 50% non-affiliated. Again, this is to encourage the independent decision making, mixed of medical as well as non-medical, and members need training from time to time, and they must have some qualities, willingness to give their time and be committed for this important work. And then the institution needs to provide adequate budget, staff support, protected time for member secretary. Usually member secretaries are also faculty in different departments, so they need some time to devote to the ethics committee work. The qualifications, roles, and responsibilities of all members have been explained in detail. And there are special situations where a bigger institution could have more than one ethics committee. So if you think that the number of proposals being handled by one committee is like too much for them to handle, you could have more than one ethics committee. Or you could have a separate one for student research, which has to meet in a time-bound manner. Also, when there is multi-center research, a single review can be done jointly by one designated ethics committee rather than every institution reviewing it at their own level. And an ethics committee can also appoint subcommittees for its work. For example, for reviewing annual reports or for reviewing essays, there could be subcommittees. And I think I mentioned about exemption, expedited, full reviews. Another suggestion that is made in the guidelines about having alternate members. So especially in the COVID time, we saw that, we had to meet very frequently. And if, let's say, the legal expert is not available on that day, you can't have a meeting because your quorum will not be fulfilled. So it may be a good idea to have alternate members who are also appointed member who could be invited or at that time when the main member is not available. So at least in our ICMR committee, we have a set of alternate members. So if the social scientist is not available, we can invite the alternate social scientist to come in because we don't have to delay the meeting because of that reason, because this review has to be done in a very time-bound manner. And patient representatives or subject experts can also be invited, depending on your study, because the ethics committee is a small group of 7 to 15 members. They will not have expertise of everything. It may be a highly specialized subject. So it may be a good idea to have a subject expert come in and speak. And they are non-voting, they are not part of decision-making, but they will just come and give information. And ethics committee members need to be trained a little bit about what is research. They must know about it. What are the methodologies, the designs? They must have a little bit of understanding about, what is a placebo, what is randomization. So they must be familiar with all these terminology, whether it's a lay person, they should know, they should be educated. And the principles of and the guidelines, the various designs, conflicts of interest, SOPs, review procedures of the committee. And like I said, the ethics committee will look at science and ethics, and these are all the things. It will see what is the social value, how the design is, how it will be conducted, the methodology, benefit risk ratio, selection of participants, payments, privacy, community considerations, qualifications, whether the PI has the qualifications, the site has all the required facilities. If there is an injury, is the site capable of managing that? What kind of medical management compensation is available, and how the informed consent will be done, by whom, at what place, is it in a separate room, is it on a crowded OPD, what is the setting for that? All of this ethics committee will see. And this is how the guidelines have categorized exempt, expedited, and full review. where, you know, the research is on topics which are really public domain, you know, for example, census data, you're trying to do something, or meta-analysis, systematic reviews, where there is absolutely no identifiers, the study can be exempt, or it could be expedited where, you know, there is some data, it is non-identified, admin typo amendments are there, revisions, deviation, all these can be expedited. And full review where there is some kind of risk involved or a vulnerable group of people is involved, there are major amendments which may, you know, change the way participants may accept or not accept them. So those will go for full committee review. So the ethics committee will look at science, ethics, and informed consent form, to look at all the scientific aspects in general, but in regard to ethics, because the science is important, unless there is good science, the ethics component will not be good as well. So it's important for all this and for ethics committee to review the consent form also, and to see that, you know, there is a match. Sometimes we see protocol says something else and consent form says something else. So it is the same information. What are patient responsibilities in simple language? Normally we say that 7th grade reading level should be the level of the consent form so that anybody can understand. And ethics committee can recommend test of understanding, you know, because ask some open-ended questions from the participant to see that whether they have really understood what has been explained to them. The role of ethics committee is not just before, but it continues during and after, because they need to monitor how the research is being conducted, if there are any other concerns, and if there is any need for anything to be reviewed, changed. So they must ask the investigator to submit reports. They could be quarterly for a high-risk research. For a low-risk research, just an annual report should be sufficient. So they need to do an oversight. SAE committee, sometimes many institutions have SAE committees, and all the continuing review reports, deviations, they have to be reviewed. Site monitoring is also possible if the committee is concerned, they can actually visit the site. Subcommittees, like I said, can be appointed by the committee. It is just chairperson, member secretary, and 1 or 2 members who could do this reviews. During COVID-19, ethics committees had to adapt. A lot of things they had to change, reduce timeline frequencies, digital meetings, shorter agendas, science ethics, subject experts, patient representatives, alternate members, common review of multi-center research, conflicts of interest, novel methodologies, monitoring, collaborations, vulnerabilities, all the things I said about, you know, I already spoken about. These were some of the new things that ethics committee had to really put them into practice. Roles of each members have been defined in the guidelines, and so this is about the you know, chairperson's role, legal expert, social scientist, layperson, subject expert. These are given in detail, and it's very important that sometimes non-medical members do not understand their role, and usually the clinicians do the talking, and that is not how the ethics committee should be. Every member of the ethics committee is very important, and especially the non-medical members have to bring in the societal and the patient perspective into the ethics committee, and their role is important. The legal experts often do not understand their own role, and they must make sure that the research is as per the national guidelines and regulations and laws. And if they have to review any clinical trial agreements or any MOUs or material transfer agreements, so some of the regulatory aspects, the legal expert can really guide the ethics committee in that. Yes, and so during the COVID-19, the requirement was, this is not expedited review, it is expeditious review. So because we did not have time and ethics committee had to respond, so maybe the ethics committee is meeting, let's say once in 2 months, but now they had to meet more frequently, sometimes weekly basis or you know, bi-monthly basis. And but the important thing is they should not compromise on the quality of review, on the patient safety aspect. In spite of fast tracking, the review has to be as robust as possible, and therefore they need to be open to alternate methods and to understand the national cause at this time and update according to it. So common review of multi-center research is an important suggestion, and for our ICMR studies, we use this, although it's not very easy to implement because The problem is that, if there is one ethics committee which does a review, the other institutions ask, why this committee? Are they more senior or are they more important than us? And which is not correct. If there are 5 institutions and all the ethics committees are at par. So what the guidelines have suggested is that they all come together and they can join the virtual meetings. They can easily join and share their perspective from their own institution. But generally they should give the work to a designated ethics committee. Generally the coordinating site, the main site of the study, the PI, can become the coordinating site, and that ethics committee can do a full review and pass on the suggestions to the other institutions who can, at their own secretariat level, without going to the full meeting, they can actually review whether they are agreeable to the suggestions by the main designated committee and go ahead and accept that approval. So this is something new that has been suggested in the guidelines. So it has to be implemented. We have done it in our own ICMR studies, but then it is for other institutions to also take up and work on that. Some bit of effort will, of course, be required. Informed consent, on your left-hand side, you see all the basic elements that must be part and parcel of every consent form. So the consent form is one is to disclose the information, all the relevant information to be disclosed in a manner that is understandable. It is easy to understand or easy to comprehend for the participant. And the participant to have the competence. He or she should be competent to understand, which means it should be in a language that he understands, and he should have that level of understanding, and that information as per the need of the participant should be given. And then after understanding, if he wants to discuss with family, friends, they should not be forced that you have to sign it today, otherwise you will not be part of the study, because that becomes undue, coercion. So they must be given that chance to voluntarily agree to be part of the study. Now it's very easy to say, but it's very difficult for the researcher to do, because on one hand, the researcher is trying to recruit as many participants. And on the other hand, if they spend so much time in telling every patient, he or she may not decide to participate, and that will take away a lot of time. So it's a very tricky thing to say, and that is why ethics committee may say that you have a team. You could have counselors, depending on the type of study. You could have some study staff can do all the explaining and spend some time with the participants. And there are some additional elements that can also be included in the consent form, depending on the type of study. Now we had to move to electronic consent, something new that has been suggested before, but we had to actually implement that because of the social distancing norms. So one could think of taking informed consent, not just in a form, but it could be via email. The important thing is how we document it. It could be through an app. It could be through any website or any other platform. It could be WhatsApp. It could be text messages. But the important thing is for the researcher to document that, and to so that if the ethics committee has any doubt, they should be able to check out that really that consent has been taken. We don't want that these electronic and such suggestions are misused actually. So we have to make sure that these are methods which are followed properly. Now, about vulnerabilities, we understand people who are vulnerable, children, for example, who are not able to consent, who are not in a legal age of or incapable of protecting their own interests. But a lot of time, other people, very healthy, normal individuals, can also become vulnerable in certain circumstances. And during this time, we saw that even healthcare workers had become highly vulnerable because they are exposed to the risk. And there's so much of psychological stress, trauma that they are seeing. Otherwise, also in general, people face so much. Elderly persons became highly vulnerable, migrants, people who are really poor, communities. So these are people who need to be protected. So the ethics committee has an important responsibility to see that how can these people be included. It's not the principle of exclusion. A lot of time we find it much easier to say we will exclude all vulnerable people from research. If we exclude everyone, that means when the benefits of research are out, they will not apply to this group of people, which has happened with us, with children, pregnant women, because when the research, COVID studies were not done on these groups, so the outcomes are not applicable to them as well. And that's why vaccines are not available to these groups. Still, it will take time because the research has to be completed. So one has to see at what point of time how these people can be meaningfully engaged in research. It requires extra effort, it requires extra time, but it is important to keep them included. And therefore, the ethics committee form that ICMR has designed asks the question, are the vulnerable people included or excluded? Give reasons. So if you have excluded, then also give reasons. If you have included, also give reasons how these people will be safeguarded. So it is very important that we all think about these people. There is a whole section on clinical trials and talks about, so clinical trials have to follow the new drugs and clinical trial rules under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. Now that is a law in the country. And that is for those products which have to be marketed. So the DCGI approval is for marketing, bringing out new products in the market. But then there are a lot of other clinical trials also that are not for marketing approval. For example, academic trials, investigator-initiated trials. So, or trials on proven products. So these also need to follow. So ICMR guidelines need to be followed for all this. And this chapter is important for that. Public health research and socio-behavioral research. These are two sections. They talk about demographic studies, surveillance programs, program evaluation, registries, observational studies. So how can meaningfully research be done, qualitative study designs? So these issues have been discussed in detail. Then genetics is another whole section because genetics is a lot more complicated topic because there are a lot of ethical, legal, social issues related to the new technologies, consanguinity, prenatal, pre-implantation genetic diagnostics. We have CRISPR now, gene editing, chimps, whatnot. So these are the variety of other, and then secondary participants. You are collecting a pedigree. You're collecting information not only about an individual, but the whole family. What kind of consent is needed for collecting information from the secondary subjects? How, if you find out an information, how this is going to be communicated to the family? Because you cannot share diagnostics with one patient with another person. So how do you do it more meaningfully because it may be relevant to the needs of that person? So this is a whole lecture in itself, actually. So I'm only briefly touching on it. And biobanking data sets is an extremely important section for all of us. Every researcher must go through it. The way samples or data have been categorized is three. Either these are anonymous, which means they are totally de-linked with any identifying information. So a different set of ethical requirements and informed consent requirements apply to these samples. Now, the second category is anonymized, where you have linked information, but it can be coded, so you have a register somewhere, but on the sample, it's not labeled to whom it belongs to, but you have a code. And you can break the code and go back to the person. So this is the anonymized or coded information. So a different set of requirements apply to this. And then identified information or linked, this sample belongs to this person. So what kind of research can you do using this? So if you are using linked or directly identified sample, you need proper informed consent. If it is coded sample, then depending on the nature of research, the ethics committee may allow you to do the research. If the results or outcome of that research are not going to be of use and you don't need to go back to that participant, in that case, the ethics committee may ask you for taking a waiver of consent, that you could do that study without a consent. And of course, if it is anonymous, you cannot take consent for that sample. It's a leftover sample. So depending on these categories, one needs to see what kind of consent is to be devised. And this section has also talked about all this benefit sharing and governance of biobanking. So biobank doesn't mean a big bank or a big lab, but even a small refrigerator of an individual researcher or clinician is a biobank. There is a lot of sample which is stored or a lot of data that is stored. So that is a biobank. So how can this be meaningfully shared? And it belongs to the institution. A number of times faculty get transferred and they say, this is my sample and I like to carry it. So that is not how it is, because we as researchers are custodians. Institutions, researchers are all custodians of this sample. It belongs to the institution where it is. The owner is the person who has given the sample. The owner is the patient. but we are custodians of it. So ethics committee will look at those aspects before they give approval. And so during emergencies, this was already a section was there which talked about preemptive preparation, unscheduled meetings, waivers of consent, fair selection, preventing stigma. So some of the issues were already tackled in the guidelines, but then we came up with the new guidelines as well. Another important thing that came out was a standard operating procedures for emergency review of research, because we realized that many ethics committees do not have any procedure for undertaking an emergency review of research. This can be easily downloaded from our website. We haven't put our logo or anything. Any institution is free to adopt them, put their own logo. If you see our common forms also, there is space for the logo of the institution. So you can just download. They are available in Word document as well as PDF, download, adopt it. If you would like to add some of your own questions relevant to the type of research being done in your institution, you're free to add that and adopt them. We want them to be used because these forms are extremely important, because the problem that we have seen as surveyor of ethics committee also have seen that researchers actually, they write a protocol according to the format of the funding agency. It does not address ethics issues at all, actually. So the researcher is himself not aware that how privacy confidentiality concerns will be taken care of. Or if there is an injury, how is he going to handle that? How the medical management will be provided? So the questions that are raised by the ethics committee are not, the researcher has never given a thought about it. So this form will ask those questions and help the researcher think before it submits to an ethics committee that in what way the informed consent will be done. So those questions will help him plan better study at that time before they submit to the ethics committee. So this is again, like I said, this is not just one form. There are a series of forms. It has forms for initial review, expedited reviews, then essay reporting, continuing review, the CVs of format, how they should be submitted to the ethics committee, and annual report formats. All these, there are 10 or 12 formats that are there in this. So this is another suggestion that one can have a look. And I'm coming to the end of my talk, and this is just to tell you that how we at the National Ethics Committee, at Central Ethics Committee, how did we respond? So ICMR, as you know, has been involved in all kinds of research studies. The various sero surveys that you see have been done, various quantitative and qualitative studies, clinical trials such as the plasma study, implementation studies, socio-behavioral, all kinds of studies were done. And we were working last year literally day and night, and our average turnaround as an ethics committee was 24 to 72 hours. So the moment a proposal was submitted, the ball started ticking, and we would fix the meeting immediately, and research reviews were completed within 72 hours. And of course, we found that virtual meetings were very beneficial. Very easily, we could connect with the best experts across the country. And so many web meeting platforms are now available. And this is another slide where I wanted to tell you that this guideline has been downloaded in more than 40 countries across the globe. And also in so many states, there are more than 5,000 downloads now actually from across the globe. And also ICMR guideline is the only guideline from any developing country in the world which is recognized by the US OHRP. If you file a FWA, the Federal Wide Assurance, you would find that they say that whether you follow the US rules or the Canadian guideline or ICH GCP and the Indian guideline, these are the only 4 documents that are listed to offer equivalent protections. We feel honored that to be amongst that. And this is my last slide, and that is about the National Ethics Committee Registry, which is set up as DHR. Now it is mandatory for every ethics committee to register on DHR. We have created a NATIC portal, NATIC, which is ethics in Hindi, has been created, and every ethics committee needs to be registered here. It's an online portal, and this is to urge every ethics committee to register, if not. And in case of any difficulty, please let me know. And also, these were some of the questions that I had received from Dr. Nand Kumar. And so I'll be happy to answer some of these questions. And I think I have partly answered the question about retrospective patient, clinical, and lab data. And Dr. Nand Kumar, I think you will be the right person. If you want further clarification on this, please let me know. I'll be very happy to tell you more about it. Over to you.
Thank you,
Dr.
ma'am. Thank you. I mean, it's been very exhaustive, and while we were listening to you, most of the questions we had in mind were answered by such very detailed sections and components that you mentioned, especially about the COVID thing. But we'll keep the floor open for questioning. These were like the questions what we had put as broad areas. These were the usual questions at the Division of Research when we interact with our faculty for helping them to write the protocol. So these questions were the ones which usually come across. So as you told, the first question on retrospective patient and clinical data, most of them would have done it as a routine collection of data as a course of patient treatment or patient engagement. And when they have to start a study, they would say that, sir, we would want to go back and do a retrospective study design. But in such cases, the consent would not be explicitly obtained for conducting that particular study. So in that sense, like, our understanding was like as long as they're using anonymized thing without linking the individual data to that patient, A, and the outcome of that study, if it does not have a bearing on the patient's individual's outcome, then probably they can use. So that was the question which we wanted to ask.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a challenge because when do we put a stop to that? Because this will keep going on and on forever. Like your ethics committee may decide that, okay, tell the researchers that, we are allowing, but from now on, if you have plans that you would like to use your clinical data or samples for future studies, why don't you inbuilt into your consent process at the time when the samples are being collected? It could be a very simple checkbox actually in the consent form, in the patient consent which is taken usually in the hospital, that whether you could add a point there that I am okay with my samples to be used for future research after anonymization. So that will sort of sort it to a great extent. For certain types of research, you could decide that what type of research can that be used for. Because like you said, if it has bearing on the outcomes of the research, have a bearing on the patient, then that may not be ethically acceptable. So for certain types of research studies where you would like to analyze some data or records, you could allow that. Where it does not have, like for example, you just want to see how many patients came, how many patients were of what category. So certain type of administrative studies which do not go back to the results, do not have any bearing on the patient. On the other hand, it is a blood sample or it's a DNA sample, and the outcomes of that mutations analysis should go back to the patient. And there you have not taken consent, then it may not be ethically appropriate to do that study without an informed consent, because tomorrow the patient will say, I never gave my consent for genetic studies, so how come that was done? So, yes. And then you could also have one checkbox asking that whether you would be like to be recontacted. If you would like to do research, whether you would like to be recontacted. So some of these suggestions are there in the guidelines that you could put in your form, and those patients or their samples could be used for future research in a more respectable, ethical manner, so that they do not feel that their rights are being violated.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for that. Medha ma'am has a question.
No, that was a good one, I think.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Dr. Shalini Nui ma'am has a question.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask, in a similar manner, if we have a prospective study where we want to look at symptoms of patients, do we have to, are we committed to, bearing all the expenses of the patients?
No, not at all. If there is a research, so one is, your patients are coming for routine clinical care. So that routine clinical care is the standard which is there. Now you would like to add a certain element, and that is your research component. Only that part needs to be covered for research. If you are adding an extra test, for example, which is not part of the routine medical care, then you need to cover for that.
Okay.
It's not that everything needs to be covered.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
But
And
if
one
you're
more
doing
question.
that as a research study alone and the patient is normally not coming for that, it becomes a different story.
No, we expect the patient to come for a follow-up, and if necessary, we ask for certain investigations. In such cases,
Yeah, so again, it is sort of tricky that whether these investigations are for routine care or are these investigations being done for the sake of research. So that distinction must be clear. What are the added components of the study? And you're talking prospective, so it becomes very tricky because many ethics committees will say that if it is a research, then it should be totally brought, under the research fund. It should be totally funded for a prospective study. Because if you're planning a prospective study, it will usually be under a research grant. So that research grant should cover all costs of patient participation.
okay, right. Thank you, thank you. And one more question. You talked about alternate members. Is there any limit to the number of alternate members we can have?
As of now, we have not fixed any limit to that members, but I can give you our example. Like we have 4 social scientists. So we usually invite 1 or 2. So we have another few alternates. So,
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
We have a question from Dr. Lalita and then a couple of questions on the chat. I will read it out. Dr. Lalita, madam, you can ask the question.
Thank you, Nanda. And thank you, ma'am. That was very interesting and informative as well. Ma'am, I have a question. When we are doing community-based surveys, we had this kind of ethical dilemmas or what to say. For example, we had to have a written consent from the patients, especially when we were doing for a geriatric population. It was a survey-based research. But the patients, I mean, the subjects refused to sign or put the thumb impression for the fear of being deceived for various reasons. Because, Bangalore, there is a lot of chance for deceiving them. What do we do in that case? But they were very much interested to be part of the study. They would get interested to give all the information, but not necessarily sign. So should we exclude such people is the question, and how do we handle such situation?
Yeah. So now there are various suggestions to your question, and so important. See, what is the purpose of having somebody sign? Now that is to make sure that the person has understood and agreed to participate. That is the purpose of signing, right? So in such cases, you could think of some, impartial witness who could sign on their behalf, who would witness that, this process has happened. However, this has to be priorly approved by the ethics committee. So your concerns need to go to the ethics committee and you have to suggest the solutions actually, that how you would do a more meaningful informed consent process. So you could say that we would have such and such community. That's why we need to build that trust. Or you could identify a community representative who would be present or who would make sure that, yes, you have communicated that information and we will sign on that behalf. There is something called as oral consent also that is permitted by the ethics committee. So oral or verbal consent can also be taken. It can be audiovisual recorded also if you would like. The other thing is that when you do oral consent, you have a form, still you have a form of what information will be read out to the people so that they know what it is all about. And again, a witness will sign that form on behalf of that participant because of these things. You could go to the ethics committee and I think ethics committee will be considerate enough to agree to find a suitable solution. See, there is no hard and fast rule. That is one thing about ethics. It is not so black and white. So what I say, you have to apply in a given situation. So depending on the study, the situation, as a researcher, actually you're the best judge to see what is the right way for your study. And you have to tell that, communicate that to the ethics committee so that they are on the same page and they will help you in the process. They are not to stop research, they will facilitate research. So that's why guidelines don't black and white talk that this should not be done, this should be done. It just shows you the path to find a way forward.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
I will.
Clarity.
We have the next question from Dr. Nayanjit Chowdhury, who has typed in. How important is it for the members of the, I'm reading it, Ravi.
Yes, sorry, please.
How important is it for the members of the ethics committee to be up to date with the science of research vis-a-vis contemporary ethical issues?
Of course, ethical issues, they have to be updated of all the new guidelines, but they cannot be updated on all the scientific issues. Every day, the way science is galloping, it is not possible to keep up with the science. And that is why there is a provision for inviting independent consultants or subject experts for particular areas. I have seen that in many institutions, especially in the many other countries, that they have a subject expert panel who is appointed. So if you have a nephrology protocol coming in, naturally, you don't expect the members of ethics committee to understand specific areas, or it could be genomic study. You could have the subject expert come in and tell you about it, and then focus on the ethical aspects of that study.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Next, we have Srivara sir, who is the head HR and also a part of our ethics committee. Sir, you can ask the question. Srivara sir, you can unmute and ask the question, sir.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have two questions. I put it on the chat box also. The not questions actually. One is the compensation formula in the 7th schedule of the new Drugs and Clinical Trials Act 2019 is very inadequate. There are two. One is for the dead people, another for the injured. Among the injured, they have made 3 categories, etc. If you kindly see the formula, it is outdated rather. The compensation they get is so meager, and it does not comply with the observations made by many rulings of the Supreme Court. I mean to say, the compensation formula is to be revised immediately. That's an important work remaining for as far as these rules are concerned. That is one my feeling, one my suggestion. Secondly, madam, this scientific committee is really extremely helpful. At least in our career, I have experience only in one ethics committee, and the scientific committee headed by our madam, principal madam, is doing such a wonderful thing. Its observations are extremely useful for us. So by our experience, we would like to say that the scientific committee should be made mandatory, and it is very helpful. Of course, the opinion of the scientific committee is not binding on the ethics committee, and we can review, but the suggestions they make are extremely valid. These are my observations. Anyway, the most important thing I want to tell is your presentation was extraordinary. It was extremely good. I enjoyed it. I heard from the beginning to end, and I really appreciate thank all the organizers who have taken pains to rope in your valuable time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind words. It's really encouraging to hear. You have made very important observations. They are both very important. So I'll begin with the scientific committee, and that is extremely important. As you rightly said, a scientific committee review prior to an ethics committee review is extremely helpful. However, I just want to bring it to your notice that when the national guidelines are made, they are made for all kinds of institutions. Some are very small institutions, some are NGOs, some are huge institutions. So the guidelines have provided flexibility for an institution to choose for themselves what is the mechanism that they would like to follow. Another important point is that between the scientific committee and ethics committee, there must be a bridge, because sometimes if no members are common between the two committees, the information of the scientific committee on what basis they deliberated and will not go back to the ethics committee, and they may raise some diagonally different comments actually, which also happens. And they will raise scientific queries and not be happy with scientific review. That happens all the time as well. So I have seen, I can give you the example of Tata Memorial Hospital, where they have set up a system where they have a scientific committee, they have ethics committee, and some members or member secretaries are common between the committees, so that they can take back the good advice that is received from the scientific committee and share it when the same point is discussed during the ethics committee. So it saves time and effort. So it is extremely relevant point that you have made. The second point about the DCGI formula, thankfully, I'm not part of DCGI, I am part of ICMR. And of course, I have been part of the initial discussions, and this formula was derived at with very great difficulty after so many meetings. And I think you need to prepare your comments and submit it to DCGI, because I was not aware that institutions are finding it difficult to follow the formula, because as of what feedback that we have seen so far is that it's working. And for biomedical health research, there is no formula. We have not given any formula in the ICMR guidelines. So this formula is only for clinical trials, and that too regulatory clinical trials. But for biomedical health research, we have left it to the ethics committee for them to judge, because, you know, it may be an academic study, a student project, and, you know, so it does not need compensation, you know, that huge formula thing. But we say that ethics committee in their right decision making should decide that if medical management can be provided, in what way can participant be helped. So we have left it open, but we are very open to suggestions if you want a formula for biomedical research, because it sort of binds your research. If you put too much of these formulas, it is often very difficult to implement. So ICMR guidelines have not given any formula, but DCGI has given, because they had the pressure from the government, from Supreme Court, that some formula should come up. So they had actually derived this from the Motor Vehicles, some accident act is there. So from that, they had derived this formula.
Correct.
So
Thank
you for your question.
Thank you for your response. But my doubt is, in fact, they have not revised this formula. There are 4 formulas. One is for the dead, another 3 subdivisions under the injured. These formulas have not been revised when the rules were revised. I think this should be taken care of.
Would you like to write to us? We can always forward your suggestions to DCGI. If you can write to us, what are your suggestions, or if you have an example of any other formula that can be better implemented, it will be, we can forward your suggestions to DCGI. Of course, it's not in my purview, but we will still, we are in contact with them, so we can share with them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thanks, ma'am, for that response. Before taking the next question from the chat, Chidambaram Murthy, who is the principal scientist, would want to ask a question on CRL.
Good evening, ma'am. This was a very informative presentation. And from the research point of view, I have a couple of questions. Like, as you told, like, you take a blanket consent before we start, we have a checkbox and say that it can be used for other purpose also. Toward this, like, after presenting to a scientific committee and discussing with the peers and experts, we sometimes end up in, like, not the biochemical thing, let us do a genomic study. So initial plan will be only to the diagnostic, routine diagnostic, and then we want to extrapolate it to genomic study. In such cases, can we take a blanket approval? Because we know we have a separate protocol for genomic thing. Consent form is different. We follow that. But can we use it as a blanket thing? That's my first question.
From what I have seen so far, no ethics committee will allow a blanket consent of that nature. Blanket consent could only be given for certain types of research, you know, very basic research, which do not in any way impact upon the health. But let us say you are trying to develop a kit or something, you know, diagnostic tool you are trying to, then you could, you know, you have to be very specific in the consent form that what kind of tool you are developing or for what purpose. So absolutely a blanket consent, most ethics committees will not permit. They will not permit that you take a blanket that my sample can be used for any kind of research. I don't think that will
I was referring to a recent pandemic thing when we started with immunity marker. Then we thought we'll also look at DNA and other things. So in such case, so knowing the specific case, what we can do using the DNA, can we take such approval?
So if I may suggest, so what you could have is that in your generic consent form, you could say that whether he or she will be like to be contacted for further genomic or immunologic studies. You could give that option, and those patients could be contacted separately, or you could have a separate consent form for that purpose, where you tell what is the purpose and what is it all. Mainly, see, you as a researcher has to see how we can do it in a more ethical manner. It is for you to see, actually.
Yeah, no, like, is there any, and other thing is like, because of this pandemic, a lot of our research, routine research, some of them are halted, like unforeseen thing. So what is the call and validity of this? Each of protocol will have 2 years of validity. So is there any general guidelines, or it is left to the individual committee to decide?
Yeah, so usually ethics committees had to meet and give extensions. If the PI wants extension, their research study could not be completed, extensions can be given. It is as per need basis, you could just see what is needed and work along with the researchers. So most of the ethics committees have given extensions, or some changes in methodologies have to be done. A follow-up which was done physically may be done telephonically. So some amendments are there which could be reviewed at the secretariat level itself. Need not go to the main committee also if these changes are minor. They don't affect the safety of the participant. They can be, actually a lot of work can be done by the secretariat. If there is a strong secretarial support available, so the member secretary can take certain decisions without having them go to the main committee.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for that. We have Dr. Nayanjit Chowdhury. Dr. Nayanjit, you have been made a panelist. You can ask the question, sir. You can unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Nandakumar. Thank you, Dr. Rowley, madam, for a very elaborate and educational session. I know you have crossed beyond your time, but you have provoked us to really ask, very intriguing questions. So thank you for that. Well, this is my last question. Is there any particular provision for working with government data, and not necessarily retrospective, even prospective data? For example, many a times private sector partners with the governments, particularly state governments, on public-private partnership formats. And a lot of research, particularly translational and implementation research, happens there. So are there specific provisions for ethical issues, number one? Number two, informed consent, because you can't really take informed consent of let's say people, subjects that are into databases like say HMIS or IDSP or NPCDCS program or NVDCP. So what provisions do exist to ensure privacy, confidentiality, and also informed consent of those people on which the research database is for?
Okay. So your first question, as I see, is about public-private partnership. And so there is no such thing that stops any private and government body to getting together. So first of all, I don't see that premise at all, in the sense that when at least my work at ICMR, we've never had this kind of any consideration that this is a private institution and this is a government, so we choose this. That has not been a concern. And when I can give you the example where we did a newborn screening study. So half of the centers were in private hospitals, because we want the inclusion of all kind of centers, all kind of sites in the study. So there is no such rule that says that the first part of your question, that how to engage with government. You are free to. I mean, we have engaged with all sectors. So that is it's only that one looks at academic partners where research is possible. So in fact, sites are important where patients, for my genetic studies, I know half of my sites were in private hospitals because they are providing good genetic services. So they were part of the study very much in most of the task force studies. So that consideration is not there. The second part is you're talking about the HMIS and other data which are existing in the public databases. And this comes under the gray zone of consenting, because the data that is being collected for public health programs, it is not, it does not have the consent provisions built into it right now. Only when you are collecting, when the primary objective of collecting that data is research, that the informed consent form is built into it. Right? So now all this data which has been collected for public health programs is, if it is anonymized, it could be used for further future research. But if it is identified data, then there have to be several safeguards of making sure how this data can be meaningfully more used. So this has to be worked out on an individual level as to what data you need, whether you need anonymized data or whether you need identified data for the kind of research that you would like to do. It has to be a one-to-one your discussion for development of program. If it is a large program, it's a government initiated program. If it's a task force, there would be a group of experts who will sit and discuss these issues in detail. So I don't know whether I have answered your question, but you please let me know specifically if there is any further questions.
I fully resonate. I was part of the childbirth checklist study, Dr. Atul Gawande, in UP. So yeah, I fully agree. I mean, as far as informed consent is concerned, as far as ethical review is concerned, I think there is no discrimination, absolutely well. However, particularly when foreign funded studies come, we were part of I was part of two major studies. One was the heart rescue program that we did with Ramaiah, in fact. I was part of the funding agency at that time. So, and that required an HMSC clearance. Now, HMSC took us more than a year. So usually what happens is the funding agency has a stipulated period of time. So therefore, in the other project, which we did in Udaipur and Shimla, we did not have much time because the funding agency had already spent 2 years preparing for the project. Now, practically, we were left with only 3 years or so of the 5-year-old project. And then we went to ICMR. So there were differences of opinion. When I went to some of the specific officers at ICMR, they said, no, you need an HMSC clearance here. But then I was not convinced, because if we go for HMSC, it would take me another year, and therefore probably the funding would be over. So we went and met the DG at that time, was Dr. Swaminathan herself. So she gave us a very, very patient listening, and she said, well, it's a one-on-one basis, but in particularly your case, if the data belongs to the government, then you don't need an HMSC, per se. So in the interest of time, and also safeguarding the privacy and the confidentiality of the data, if you tie up with the government, then maybe it's a better. So I fully agree with what you are saying, but if there are provisions that, that are readily available, I think the guidance would be much more clearer. That's why I raised this issue.
No, you are absolutely right, because you have the practical experience of these challenges that you have faced on the ground. And these experiences are important for us to know, because that is how we can improve. The other thing is about HMSC. There has been a lot of discussion going on, and I understand from what I am told that now HMSC has gone completely online in the last 1.5 years. And they take a maximum time level of 3 months is the time that has been set out by DG. So I hope that in future you will not have those difficulties and those. I completely understand what you're saying, because generally when the funding agencies, foreign funding agencies, and there is a time-bound activity and takes so much time, the whole idea is to facilitate and quicken the research. And I know there are challenges too.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. This resonates really. Thank you very much.
It's 4 o'clock. We will stop with just last question from one of our clinicians, Dr. Akshay Rao, who asks that data generated from online consultations. Now it's most of the consultations are e-consultations. How best can physicians go about to proceed with research in an ethical manner with regards to both consent and ethical committee clearances?
So I'll come back to the point where I said that as a clinician, you wear a different hat, and as a researcher, you wear a different hat. So if you are conducting a consultation and online with a patient, that you are perfectly within your rights to ask or do whatever you want, because that you as a clinician, you have a prerogative to decide the treatment, everything. Now, if you would like this data to be used for research, you have a different set of standards you need to follow, which means that you have to write a protocol, first thing. A lot of time clinicians ask, I have all this data, and they will write a paper, do the analysis, and submit it to a journal. And now the journal is asking for an ethical approval. So they will come to the ethics committee for a post facto approval that I've already analyzed this data. And now journal needs a ethical approval. Please give the ethics approval. That is not at all correct. You have plans to analyze your data. You can. Nobody's stopping you. You can. Just write a protocol, a small protocol, 3-page, 2-page, 1-page. You write objectives, methodology, what you have, why you need a waiver of consent, why it was not taken, and take an approval from an ethics committee. Then do your analysis and publish. So that is what, as physician, we need to realize, that we cannot use my own patient data for research. Sorry for being so loud and
Made our
clear.
job easier. Dr. Mehta ma'am will agree.
Impactful.
Because we end up with a dilemma many a times with regards to publications. In fact, we have a very supportive research ecosystem here, where the Division of Research, the Scientific Committee for students and for faculty, it's sort of like well-oiled, and people are aware. Despite that, when it comes to some of the papers and publications, we do enter into these challenges. So probably through these educative training programs that we are having, we can impress upon them that, like, small protocol, however small it is, can be written a priori, and they can proceed with it. So I think it's 4 o'clock. We will probably will require more sessions from your experience, ma'am. We will have specific sessions on some of the public health components that has been very clearly delineated, especially in the recent guidelines. So the population health ethics and public health challenges are something which might need to have, because of international consortia that are coming in together. So we might have to address a few issues. So thanks for your time. I'll request Dr. Rathai Rajgopal, who is the coordinator for this program, who helped us with the entire logistics in a very short time, to say the vote of thanks. Rathai.
I think I consider it my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks. At the outset, I would like to thank our guest speaker, Dr. Roly, for this wonderful and very informative talk. I think I have personally gained a lot from this talk. Thank you so much. I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to our management, who have been extremely supportive in helping us conduct various workshops. I would like to thank our principal and dean, Dr. Medha Rao ma'am, and our vice principal, Dr. Shalini Nui ma'am, for encouraging us and helping us in every step for conducting such talks. I would also like to extend my grateful thanks to all the support staff, the ADP section, Mr. Ravi especially, for helping us with the logistics, and the entire DRP team. And finally, last but not the least, our audience have been a wonderful audience, and it was a very interactive and informative session. Thank you, one and all.
Thanks a lot, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, all of you.